When the bottom fell out of the American economy in October 1929, the sound wasn't just the crash of Wall Street. It was the shattering of dreams. Factories once alive with the hum of industry fell silent, their gates locked with rusting chains. Farmers who had tilled their soil for generations watched helplessly as their crops rotted in fields they could no longer afford to harvest. In cities, men in worn suits lined up for miles, not for jobs but for bread, their dignity crumbling with every step. Banks, the supposed pillars of security, buckled under the weight of panic. Families awoke to find their life savings vanished, their futures erased overnight. Homes were lost, not to fire or flood, but to the cold indifference of foreclosure. Children scavenged for scraps while their parents stared at empty plates, whispering promises they weren't sure they could keep. Amid this despair, an unshakable voice emerged, daring to challenge the storm. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a man who had felt his own body betray him to polio, now stood ready to defy an economic paralysis gripping the nation. His words were bold, almost audacious. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. But behind that confidence was a question. How do you rebuild a nation that has forgotten how to hope? What followed was not just a plan, but a gamble, a sweeping experiment unlike anything the world had ever seen. Programs born from desperation would become engines of renewal. Entire regions, once drowning in darkness, would shine with the light of possibility. And people, broken and weary, would find work, dignity and purpose once more. Yet, for every triumph, there were failures. For every job created, there was opposition. For every bold step forward, the shadows of doubt and resistance loomed. The stakes could not have been higher, a second chance for America, or its final collapse. This is the story of how the New Deal turned despair into determination and shaped a nation's future forever. On an autumn morning in 1929, the streets of Manhattan bustled with an optimism that masked the coming storm. Inside the New York Stock Exchange, traders moved in a chaotic rhythm, calling out bids and orders as if the good times would never end. But beneath the surface, cracks had already begun to form. Investors, eager to chase wealth, had borrowed heavily to buy stocks, confident that prices would climb forever. When the first tremor hit in late October, it wasn't obvious what was happening. A few shares sold off here, a bit of panic there. Then on October 29th, the dam broke. They called it Black Tuesday. In a single day, the stock market lost $14 billion, an amount that defied comprehension at the time. But the fallout wasn't just numbers on a ticker tape. Banks, which had sunk their reserves into risky investments, began to fail. One by one, they closed their doors, leaving depositors to pound on locked gates, desperate to retrieve their vanished savings. Factories, starved of credit and demand, shut down assembly lines. By 1933, nearly 13 million Americans, 1 out of every 4 workers, found themselves unemployed. Cities that had once been hubs of industry grew eerily silent, their smokestacks standing like tombstones over abandoned plants. The ripple effect spread to the countryside, where farmers already struggling under the weight of debt now faced a new enemy: nature. The once fertile plains turned into a dust-choked wasteland. Winds carried clouds of dirt so thick that they blotted out the sun, burying crops and livestock alike. Families packed what little they could into battered trucks and set off for California, hoping to find work in fields and orchards. They became the Dust Bowl refugees, moving west not in search of fortune, but survival. In cities, the crisis looked different but felt just as cruel. Bread lines stretched for blocks, men in patched suits clutching tin cups as they waited for a handout. The lucky ones found shelter in overcrowded tenements, while others built shanties from scraps of wood and metal, creating sprawling makeshift towns known as Hoovervilles. The name was no accident. President Herbert Hoover, who once promised prosperity, now bore the brunt of the nation's anger. His response, though well-intentioned, was slow and cautious. Hoover believed that the economy would correct itself and that government intervention might do more harm than good. He urged patience and voluntary aid from businesses, but patience didn't feed children, and voluntary aid rarely reached the places it was needed most. For many, hope seemed as distant as the stars. Families huddled in the cold, sharing stories of better days, trying to remind themselves that life wasn't always this way. A child might ask why his father no longer went to work, and the answer, simple yet crushing, would hang in the air: there is no work. Despair seeped into every corner of daily life, but so too did a quiet resilience. People traded what little they had. Neighbors shared food. Somehow they endured. Yet the question loomed: how much longer could they hold on? Across the nation, the cry for change grew louder, and the stage was set for someone bold enough to answer it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was no stranger to adversity. Born into privilege, he had every advantage a young man could ask for: elite schooling, wealth, and connections. But in 1921, his life changed forever. At the age of 39, polio struck, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. For many, it might have been the end. For Roosevelt, it was a beginning. The struggle to regain strength, both physical and emotional, forged a resilience that would define his leadership. He learned to hide the braces under his tailored suits, the pain behind a confident smile. He stood, or seemed to stand, when others needed him most. And in 1932, the nation, desperate for hope, chose him to lead. The campaign was electric. While his predecessor Herbert Hoover clung to stoic reassurances, Roosevelt radiated energy. His voice carried over radios across the nation, promising something radical, a new deal for the American people. It wasn't just the words, it was how he said them. There was warmth, reassurance, a sense that someone understood the suffering. In his inaugural address, he called for bold, persistent experimentation, saying, above all, try something. This wasn't just political rhetoric, it was a lifeline to millions clinging to the edges of despair. Once in office, Roosevelt wasted no time. His vision for the New Deal rested on three pillars: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief was immediate. People needed food, shelter, and jobs, and they needed them now. Recovery was about breathing life back into industries and farms that had collapsed. And reform aimed to ensure that such a catastrophe would never happen again. It was ambitious, almost audacious, but it had to be. The stakes were survival itself. Roosevelt didn't just launch programs, he sold hope. Fireside chats became his most potent weapon. Sitting in his wheelchair beside a crackling fire, he spoke directly into the nation's living rooms through the radio. His voice, steady and calm, explained complex policies in simple terms. Your money will be safer in a reopened bank than under your mattress, he told listeners after declaring a banking holiday. People believed him. Bank deposits surged. Confidence was beginning to take root. Behind the optimism lay a relentless determination to experiment. Roosevelt's team introduced projects that seemed almost impossible in their scope. The Civilian Conservation Corps sent young men into forests and parks to build trails, plant trees, and conserve natural resources. The Tennessee Valley Authority electrified rural communities that had never known light after sunset. The Agricultural Adjustment Act paid farmers to cut production, lifting crop prices and incomes. Some ideas worked better than others, but the momentum mattered most. It signaled that the government would not sit idly by while Americans suffered, yet the work was only beginning. Relief programs addressed immediate pain, but the foundations of the economy were still weak. Could they rebuild what had been broken, or were the fractures too deep? The nation held its breath, waiting to see if Roosevelt's New Deal would truly deliver. When Roosevelt announced the bank holiday in March 1933, it wasn't just a desperate act, it was a masterstroke. For 4 tense days, every bank in America was closed. Depositors couldn't withdraw their money, businesses couldn't secure loans, and the nation collectively held its breath. But Roosevelt wasn't just shutting doors, he was buying time. During those 4 days, federal inspectors worked tirelessly to evaluate banks, determining which could reopen and which needed restructuring. On March 12th, Roosevelt spoke directly to the people in one of his now famous fireside chats. His voice was calm, reassuring, and firm. He explained how the Emergency Banking Act would safeguard their deposits and prevent future collapses. When the banks reopened, something extraordinary happened. People didn't storm the doors to withdraw their money, instead they deposited more. Confidence, the currency that had been in short supply for years, began to flow again. Families who had hidden cash under mattresses now trusted that their savings were safe. It was a small but monumental step, proof that trust could be rebuilt and the bleeding could be stopped. But trust alone didn't fill empty stomachs. Hunger was an ever-present shadow for millions. Roosevelt knew that relief had to go beyond stabilizing banks. Enter the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, a lifeline that funneled millions of dollars to states, enabling them to provide direct aid for food, clothing, and shelter. In towns like Birmingham, Alabama, families lined up for sacks of flour and jars of canned goods, their gratitude tempered by the sting of dependence. The aid was a temporary balm, but for many it was the difference between survival and despair. Relief also came in the form of work. Roosevelt believed that a job offered more than a paycheck. It offered dignity. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, was born from this belief. Young men, many of them sons of farmers and laborers, were handed shovels, axes, and a new purpose. They built fire breaks in California's forests, restored overgrazed land in the Midwest, and planted millions of trees across the country. At night, they gathered around campfires, eating hearty meals and swapping stories, their spirits lifted by the sense that their work mattered. Then came the Works Progress Administration, a sprawling endeavor that employed millions of Americans. From massive bridges spanning roaring rivers to rural schools with freshly painted walls, the WPA projects became monuments to human resilience. In New York City, the WPA reconstructed LaGuardia Airport, transforming a muddy airstrip into a bustling hub of commerce and travel. In Kentucky, it built libraries in communities that had never known one, and in small towns across the nation, ordinary men and women found themselves doing extraordinary things, creating not just structures, but hope. Through these efforts, the nation began to change. The soup kitchens grew less crowded, the desperation in people's eyes gave way to cautious optimism, and the relentless despair that had gripped the country loosened its hold. Yet, these programs were just the beginning. The question remained: could the New Deal go beyond relief and address the deeper wounds of a broken economy? The answer would demand not just action, but transformation on an unprecedented scale. As factories shuttered and assembly lines froze, America's industries faced an existential crisis. Prices for goods spiraled downward, wages dropped to unsustainable levels, and the competition between businesses became a race to the bottom. Workers, desperate for any job, accepted pay cuts that barely kept food on the table. It was clear the economy was broken. In 1933, Roosevelt signed the National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA, a bold experiment to untangle this web of despair. It wasn't just about saving businesses, it was about rebuilding trust between workers, employers, and consumers. Under NIRA, industries were invited to draft codes of fair competition. These codes set minimum wages, limited working hours, and established price controls. Factories that had once exploited workers for 16-hour shifts now adhered to an 8-hour workday. Businesses that had slashed wages in a desperate bid to undercut competitors now had to play by rules designed to level the field. The iconic Blue Eagle, a symbol of compliance, began appearing in store windows and on factory doors, signaling participation in the recovery effort. Consumers were encouraged to buy from businesses displaying the emblem, tying patriotic duty to economic revival. Yet, NIRA was not without controversy. Some small businesses, unable to compete with larger firms under the new codes, closed their doors. Critics argued that the law granted too much power to industrial cartels, stifling innovation and competition. The Supreme Court ultimately struck down NERA in 1935, but its legacy endured. It had shown that government could intervene decisively to stabilize the economy and restore hope. While factories groaned under the weight of the Depression, America's farmlands faced their own crisis. Fields that once yielded bountiful harvests now produced more than the market could bear. Prices for wheat, cotton and corn collapsed, leaving farmers with piles of unsold crops and no way to pay their debts. Roosevelt's Agricultural Adjustment Act, or AAA, tackled the issue head-on. Farmers were offered subsidies to reduce their output, a counterintuitive strategy designed to drive up prices by decreasing supply. Fields went fallow, pigs were slaughtered, and milk was poured into ditches, images that sparked outrage among those who couldn't afford bread. The AAA succeeded in raising prices, but at a cost. Large landowners reaped the benefits of the subsidies, while tenant farmers and sharecroppers, many of them black, were left without land to work or homes to live in. Displaced and desperate, they joined the growing ranks of migrant workers, searching for a livelihood that seemed ever out of reach. Amid this patchwork of policies, the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, emerged as a beacon of transformation. The Tennessee Valley was one of the poorest regions in the country, a place where electricity was a luxury, and farming often meant eking out a living on soil ravaged by erosion. The TVA aimed to change that. Through the construction of dams, the region was electrified, its rivers tamed, and its people given new opportunities. Farms that had once been lit by kerosene lamps now buzzed with the hum of electric power. Flooded fields were drained and revitalized, and local industries sprang to life, feeding on the newfound energy. The TVA did more than generate electricity. It generated hope. Children who had grown up in darkness now studied under electric lights. Small towns, once isolated by geography and poverty, became hubs of activity. Yet the TVA also faced resistance. Private utility companies decried it as government overreach, and communities displaced by dam projects mourned the loss of their homes. The New Deal's recovery efforts were far from perfect, but they were transformative. Industries found a measure of stability, farmers regained some control over their livelihoods, and entire regions saw glimpses of a brighter future. Still, questions lingered. Could these measures withstand the test of time? And could the economy, so deeply fractured, truly be made whole? The answers lay in the next steps, steps that would redefine the role of government in American life. By 1933, trust in the American banking system was a distant memory. Depositors who had watched their life savings evaporate in failed banks clung to what little they had, hiding cash in coffee cans or under loose floorboards. The act of depositing money felt as risky as gambling. Roosevelt understood that without a safe banking system, economic recovery would be impossible. The answer came with the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC. For the first time, Americans were guaranteed that their deposits up to a certain limit were insured by the federal government. The transformation was immediate. Fear began to loosen its grip as people returned to their banks, no longer haunted by the spectre of sudden loss. A grandmother in Nebraska, who had sewn her savings into a quilt, now walked into her local branch with a sense of cautious optimism. A shopkeeper in Chicago, who had kept his earnings locked in a safe, reopened his account. The FDIC did more than protect money. It restored faith in a system that had betrayed so many. Yet trust in banks alone wouldn't prevent future disasters. Wall Street, with its unchecked speculation and shady practices, had played a central role in the economic collapse. To address this, Roosevelt signed the Securities Act of 1933, followed by the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, in 1934. The SEC was a watchdog, ensuring that investors were no longer gambling blind. Companies were now required to disclose financial information, allowing the public to make informed decisions. It was a shift from the chaotic, freewheeling markets of the 1920s to a system where transparency reigned. This wasn't an easy change. Some on Wall Street bristled at the new oversight, calling it an attack on enterprise. But for everyday Americans, factory workers saving for their children's futures, farmers hoping to buy new equipment, it was a lifeline. The stock market began to stabilize, no longer a wild beast, but a tool for growth and investment. While financial reforms laid the groundwork for stability, Roosevelt knew the New Deal needed to address a deeper issue, the American people's vulnerability. In 1935, the Social Security Act became law, introducing a safety net for the most vulnerable. For the elderly who had once faced the spectre of poverty in their twilight years, Social Security offered a sense of dignity. For the disabled and unemployed, it meant survival in a world that often cast them aside. A retired steelworker in Pennsylvania, who had worked the furnaces until his body gave out, now received a small but steady check, a promise that he wouldn't be forgotten. Labour reforms followed swiftly. The Wagner Act, passed in 1935, empowered workers to organise and bargain collectively. It was a revolutionary shift, giving unions the strength to stand up to powerful corporations. Strikes that once ended in bloodshed now became negotiations. Coupled with minimum wage laws, these reforms ensured that workers were no longer at the mercy of exploitative practices. A seamstress in a New York garment factory, who had once laboured 12-hour days for pennies, now had a voice and a paycheck that reflected her worth. The transformation was sweeping. From the chaos of a broken system came structures that offered security, fairness and hope. But this wasn't the end of the story. These reforms, though revolutionary, had their detractors. Powerful forces rallied against them, claiming they stifled innovation and freedom. The nation, now on a new path, would have to defend these gains in the years to come. For now, though, a glimmer of light had pierced the darkness. For all its ambition and boldness, the New Deal was not without its critics. From mansions on Fifth Avenue to humble farmhouses in the Midwest, voices rose in dissent, though for vastly different reasons. On one side stood the Liberty League, a coalition of wealthy industrialists, bankers and conservative politicians. To them, Roosevelt was no savior. He was a traitor to his class, dismantling the free market with reckless government spending and overreach. They decried the New Deal as creeping socialism, warning that programs like Social Security and the TVA would erode individual initiative and saddle future generations with unbearable debt. Their glossy pamphlets and fiery speeches painted Roosevelt as a man playing with fire, endangering the very foundations of American capitalism. The Liberty League found support among business leaders who chafed under labor reforms and higher taxes. One steel magnate compared the New Deal to a noose tightening around the neck of free enterprise. But for all their noise, the League struggled to gain traction with the average American. To the factory worker, who finally had a union, or the farmer, who could now afford seeds, their warnings seemed distant, even selfish. While the right attacked Roosevelt for doing too much, voices from the left shouted that he hadn't done nearly enough. Huey Long, the charismatic and controversial senator from Louisiana, led the charge. Known as the Kingfish, Long captivated audiences with his Share Our Wealth movement, promising to cap personal fortunes and redistribute wealth to ensure that every family could afford a home, a car, and a decent living. To the millions still struggling despite New Deal programs, Long's fiery rhetoric was magnetic. In his speeches, delivered with the cadence of a preacher, he declared that no man should own so much that it starved the rest of the nation. But Long's rise was cut short by an assassin's bullet in 1935, leaving his vision unrealized. His ideas, however, lingered, sparking debates that challenged the New Deal's limits. Critics on the left pointed to systemic inequalities that remained unaddressed, the racial disparities in relief distribution, the continued plight of sharecroppers, and the lack of federal health care. Roosevelt, navigating between these opposing forces, sought a middle path, but the tension between too much and not enough never eased. As if ideological opposition weren't enough, the New Deal faced a formidable institutional barrier, the Supreme Court. In 1935, the court struck down the National Industrial Recovery Act, ruling that it granted the president powers that overstepped constitutional boundaries. A year later, the Agricultural Adjustment Act met the same fate, dismantling the subsidies that had brought stability to struggling farmers. Roosevelt, enraged but undeterred, proposed a plan that would shake Washington to its core. The court-packing plan, as it came to be known, aimed to add up to 6 new justices to the Supreme Court, ostensibly to ease the workload of an aging bench, but transparently designed to tilt decisions in favor of the New Deal. The backlash was swift and fierce, even among Roosevelt's allies. Critics saw it as an assault on the separation of powers, a dangerous precedent that could undermine the judiciary's independence. Though the plan ultimately failed, its mere proposal sent shockwaves through the political landscape, and yet the controversy surrounding the court-packing scheme wasn't entirely in vain. Shortly after, the court began upholding key New Deal programs, signalling a subtle but critical shift. Roosevelt had lost the battle, but in some ways he had won the war. The stakes, however, had never been higher. As the dust settled, the nation was left wondering, how far could one man go to rebuild a broken system before the system pushed back? By the late 1930s, the landscape of America looked different than it had just a few years before. The breadlines, though not entirely gone, had shortened. The frantic fear of bank failures had subsided, replaced by cautious confidence. Factories that once sat silent now hummed again, their smokestacks painting trails against the sky. Unemployment, while still high, had fallen significantly from its devastating peak. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps and Works Progress Administration had put millions to work, not only restoring livelihoods, but rebuilding a collective sense of purpose. Hope, that most fragile of human emotions, had taken root once more. Yet the New Deal's impact stretched far beyond these short-term victories. It fundamentally redefined the relationship between the government and its citizens. Before the New Deal, federal intervention in daily life was minimal, often limited to defense or interstate commerce. But Roosevelt's programs introduced something new, a government that actively worked to protect and support its people during times of crisis. Social Security promised retirees and the disabled a safety net. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation ensured that a lifetime of savings wouldn't vanish overnight. These were not just policies, they were lifelines. The infrastructure built during the New Deal still stands as a testament to that era's ambition. Dams constructed by the Tennessee Valley Authority continue to generate electricity, powering homes and industries across the South. Roads, bridges and schools built by WPA workers form the backbone of communities to this day. Beyond the physical, the New Deal left a cultural legacy. The idea that government could and should act boldly in the face of overwhelming challenges. But the story of the New Deal is incomplete without acknowledging its limitations. For all its achievements, it failed to end the Great Depression. That task fell to World War II, which ignited a level of industrial production the New Deal could never match. Moreover, the benefits of New Deal programs were not distributed equally. In the South, discriminatory policies often excluded Black Americans from relief efforts, while women struggled to gain access to jobs created by federal programs. Sharecroppers and migrant workers, some of the most vulnerable Americans, often saw little of the promised aid. Despite these shortcomings, the New Deal planted seeds of change that would grow for decades. It laid the foundation for the civil rights movements of the 1960s and the women's liberation movements that followed. It redefined what Americans could expect from their government, not as an abstract entity, but as a force capable of intervening in their lives for the better. The story of the New Deal is not just one of recovery, it is one of transformation. In the darkest of times, it showed that bold action, though imperfect, could forge a path forward. Roosevelt once said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." But the New Deal proved something else, that in the face of fear, hope is not a luxury, it's a necessity. As we reflect on that era, one truth becomes clear. The New Deal didn't just rebuild an economy, it reshaped a nation. It redefined the American dream, turning it from an individual pursuit into a collective promise. And though decades have passed, its lessons remain. When the stakes are highest, bold ideas have the power to change the course of history.